What are the ingredients for creating the best chance at upward mobility for all the people who live in a given state? Utah might have the answer.
The importance that the state gives, or people in the state give, to the family structure is very good. So that's something that if other states can emulate or try to think about more deeply about it, that I think that would be key.
On this episode, we'll talk with the authors of a new study that ranks Utah as the #1 state in the nation for upward mobility. We'll explore why and where Utah can still improve. You're listening to Defending Ideas. Defending Ideas is a weekly podcast produced by Sutherland Institute. On this show, we are committed to renewing the principles of common sense conservatism, making you a better champion of sound ideas. Welcome back to another episode of Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nic Dunn, and on this episode we're talking about the American dream, and more specifically, upward mobility, especially for those trying to escape poverty or create a better life for themselves and their families. And I'm pleased today to talk with some folks from the Archbridge Institute. It's an independent, nonpartisan public policy think tank based in Washington, D.C. that focuses on human flourishing, trying to remove barriers for people to move up and improve their lives. And our guests this week are Gonzalo Schwarz, who's the president and CEO for Archbridge Institute, and Justin Callais, who's a research fellow for Archbridge. And Gonzalo and Justin, thank you so much for joining us on Defending Ideas. I'm really glad to have you with us.
Great to be here, Nick.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
You both have recently published through the Archbridge Institute a new social mobility index that ranks all 50 states, and Utah has come out on top. You ranked Utah as the #1 state for social mobility. So I want to talk to you about why that is. Number one, what data did you use? How did you arrive at the conclusion that Utah is the best state in the nation for upward mobility?
Yeah, thanks for having us on again. And with respect to Utah, the thing that kind of stood apart Utah from other states was that Utah scored either really, really well or still, where they did score lower was still middle of the pack across almost every single barrier that we considered. So we look at business dynamism or entrepreneurship. We think of places that people are able to start a business, work for a budding firm or a firm that's growing and expanding. And we think of that as one way to reach the American dream or ways to become more mobile. And Utah has the second highest business dynamic environment in the entire country. Similarly, they have really great parental engagement and stability, which is really where children can learn those sort of soft skills and ways, children spend a lot of time at school, but they spend even more time with their families. And by spending time with family and having a dynamic and stable family environment, children are able to learn and succeed. And there's a lot of studies that link childhood education and parental involvement with later terms of mobility. And also, finally, I'm sure this would be a surprise to no one at the Sutherland Institute or many of your listeners, but Utah also ranks really highly in terms of social capital, whether that's in terms of community activities or how engaged someone is in the community, as well as charity. So how willing are people to help out one another in times of need? How easy is it for someone to start a charity to begin with? Utah scores really high on basically every single one of these barriers. So they're making conscious efforts both at the state level as well as the individual and household level to make it an environment and a place where people can become more mobile and where people can succeed.
And building on that, Nick, so the idea with the index is that a lot of people in the social mobility conversation, in academic conversation, policy debates, talk about the measurement of social mobility, how mobile people are. So how usually that's measured if you out-earn your parents around the same age. That's what economists and other policy researchers do. They compare the parents' income around 32 to 40 years old, depending on the study, with their child's income around the same age. And that's how upward social mobility is measured, if you out-earn your parents around the same age. But there's very little consensus, I think, or discussion around what are the main barriers or leading indicators of what causes that more social mobility. So our index is looking at the environment or what we think are the barriers, some of the indicators that we've uncovered either through our own research or just looking at the literature from other economists or policy scholars. So we arrived at the in sort of measuring the environment for social mobility across those four big categories, which Justin mentioned with some of these indicators. So entrepreneurship is one of the pillars that we use. Rule of law and is another one. Education and skills development is the third pillar, and the fourth one is social capital. And across all those are the indicators that Justin mentioned. But I think more broadly, there isn't a discussion about what leads to a better environment for social mobility. And so that's what we try to uncover with this index. I think in measurements of social mobility in other studies in the past, actually Salt Lake City comes in as the best metro area. So I think it coincides with some of and we correlated that in our study, that it coincides our results with actual measurements of mobility that other researchers have uncovered. But sort of the backdrop is that there is not a lot of discussion of what are those main barriers or leading indicators, and that's what we're trying to do with our index.
So Gonzalo, is there something sounds like there's something that was missing at the national level? And I mean, the concept of upward mobility, it's really tied into this concept of the American dream. That's kind of an animating concept that all of us are or should be anchored to, that the promise of America is that if you work hard and play by the rules, you can have a better chance at achieving the American dream. So because it's been sort of this idea that's embedded in the ethos of our country for its entire existence, basically, why was there something missing in the debate? You mentioned some of the previous research about upward mobility. This American dream has always been central to who we are as a country. So what has been deficient in the way we publicly talk about upward mobility and social mobility that prompted you to say, we need a new and better index to really measure this?
Yes, one of the key issues is that how we discuss social mobility, we call it the economics of human flourishing. And that's in essence, I think, what the American dream is, flourishing in the US context. And how the American dream has been measured in terms of social mobility if you out-earn your parents. But I think it's a much richer concept, and it's a much more holistic concept. We have also an annual survey that measures the health and state of the American dream. And people have said that it's in decline or it's dead. But our research through the other surveys uncovers that it is very positive, that 3 in 4 Americans still believe in the American dream, that they have either achieved it or they're on their way to achieve it. And when we ask them what do they relate to the American dream, becoming wealthy is not as essential for people to achieve their American dream. The two things that they highlight more as essential for the American dream are freedom of choice on how to live. Over 80% of Americans have said that that's essential for them when they think about the American dream. And second, having a good family life. So becoming wealthy, only 13 or 14% in this last year have ranked as essential. Or owning a house or having a good retirement is around 50%, 60%, depending on the year. But the idea is that social mobility and the American dream are a much more holistic concept than just comparing your parents' income. It's about the pursuit of happiness, obviously, how the American dream is defined. The main definition of it, started by James Truslow Adams in the 1930s, is a land where people seek to live better, richer, and fuller lives, regardless of where they started. And the idea is that includes a lot of more things that are not just income. And so what we're trying to do with our index is having a more holistic conversation on social mobility, certainly having more income or being upwardly mobile in terms of the classic definition that economists use that I just explained about if you just out-earn your parents is important. You want to see that that newer generations are doing better than the previous ones, but that's not the whole story. And even within that, what leads to higher incomes is a more holistic picture. So it's not just one aspect of entrepreneurship, which also is under-researched when it comes to social mobility literature. A lot of their current research is around just studying income inequality or just figuring out how we can either change the welfare system or the tax system to allow for more mobility, but it's just redistribution or it's just tweaking with the tax system or welfare plans, which is not a sustainable long-term way in which people think about being upwardly mobile or achieving their American dreams. It's a much richer discussion, which is why we're trying to highlight across these 4 pillars, almost, I think, 45 indicators. Justin, correct me if I'm wrong. It's over 40 indicators that we're trying to look at a more holistic picture of what social mobility is without paying too much attention to that conversation on income inequality, which is important. If people are worried about income inequality, they're worried, I think, that the poor are falling behind, but it's not the fault in a way of the rich. It's the issue that there are barriers there in the middle in which middle class or upper middle class can overcome and the poor can't. But the issue are the barriers, which, as I mentioned at the beginning, there is no consensus. There hasn't been a consensus on what are the main barriers to social mobility.
Gonzalo, you're touching on something that I think is really fundamental. And just, I want to ask you about how it filtered into the actual index and the metrics you used. But Gonzalo, you mentioned that the 3 things. You say, yes, earning a good living is part of it financially, but also it's the freedom for the ability to choose how you live your life, and then a good family life. Something that we've talked about on previous episodes on this podcast, in particular with our visiting scholar Brad Wilcox, who is the co-author of our Utah Family Miracle paper that we released last summer. But that one of the things that has annoyed me about the discussion publicly about the good life, the American dream, is it seems so focused on materialistic measures. And so it's only focused on things like income. But the other things you mentioned, freedom and family, a good family life. In fact, our scholar Brad Wilcox has mentioned that when you look at the data, the number one most important predictor of happiness among adults is the quality of their marriage. And so I want to kind of underscore that the American dream is not just about money. Because if you go and ask people, what's the most important thing in your life? Yes, financial stability is going to be an important part of it, but I want to be free to live my life. I want to have a good family life. These are bigger, non-materialistic, but really essential principles of a healthy, flourishing individual, family, community, state, and nation. And so I love that you kind of framed it in that way, as these 3 principles I would put as free enterprise, freedom, and family. That ties in very much with Sutherland Institute, where we work a lot on faith, family, and freedom. So, Justin, is that an appropriate way to kind of frame this? That did those things, I guess, in what way did they make it into the index? And does that help this be a much better way to measure social mobility than most of the other metrics we hear about?
Yeah, and I think to kind of first say something that goes to what you were saying in terms of it's more than just income. I think that's part of this context of being in the United States, which is already one of the richest countries in the world. So just being an average income earner in the U.S., you have one of the highest standards of living in the entire world. So I think once you have that sort of foundation set, well, then extra income after that may not matter as much, right? If you have the, sort of sustenance level to still have a good life and take care of your family, and part of the reason you're earning that income is to then so that you can take care of yourself and your family and provide them a good life, well, then all those other margins are going to matter as well. So I think it's especially true in a country like the United States. But when it comes down to the actual measures that we include that sort of go into the holistic well-being, well, this is why we consider those 4 pillars, which I believe Gonzalo mentioned already, but entrepreneurship and growth in the sense of, well, one way that people can have the more fulfilled life is through entrepreneurship. So that means lower levels of taxation. That means less burdensome regulations where people have the opportunity to start their own business. Because, right, if you ask people, I'm sure that, going back to the income argument, if you ask people, I'm sure they'd be willing to accept a slightly lower income if it meant that they were doing something they were happy with, right? And what's one way? Well, that's often through entrepreneurship or starting your own business. So, lax regulations, lower taxes, and a dynamic business environment, meaning it's a place where activity is happening, not just, one company's growing, but a lot of other companies are growing. You're less reliant on older firms and you're more reliant on newer firms that have, new ideas and new ways to do things. When it comes down to measuring institutions and rule of law, we look at how predatory is the state, or in what sort of ways is the state getting in the way of someone's mobility. So this is in terms of how dependent a state is on fines and fees as opposed to taxation, which has to usually go through at least votes or through the legislative system or through the governor. They have to, come up with those tax policies through a systematic way, while fines and fees can be kind of levied at the will of local governments. Corruption, right? Obviously, corruption tends to discriminate against the poorest among us. Corruption is typically, benefiting the rich at the expense of the poor and middle class. So states that are overly corrupt, like, for example, Louisiana, tends to, have less mobility and more income inequality. So, in the sense, you want to make sure that the state is not predatory. We also want to make sure that the state has a, good legal system, that people not just have the opportunity to have access to justice, but that it's actually a good quality legal system where justice can actually be decided based on the merits of the case and not who has the better lawyers. And finally, when we think of education, we think of both at the school level, so throughout all of someone's lifetime, in terms of early elementary and middle school education. We also consider levels of school freedom. So how easy is it for a parent to choose their education path for their children? We look at university quality. So how successful is the university at providing an education that can lead to someone having, in this sense, higher income. But then also parental engagement and stability, right? Parents are a major driver of children's outcomes, right? The whole reason that people start families to an extent is to give their kids, when they have a family, is to give their kids the best life they can. And that's oftentimes by spending time together and being, together as a family. And finally, social capital, well, that basically comes down to the way in which people are able to help one another in times of need. How willing are you to, again, when we think of just pure income, right? When someone else is going through some problem or issue, are you willing to help them out either financially or through time and effort and just being there for your neighbors? I think all those things kind of go into play when we think about the sort of holistic kind of life cycle of mobility, right? It kind of touches on every single point. It touches on the child. It touches on someone actively in the labor force. It touches on parents and grandparents as they get older and as they, focus more on family. We really try to get a holistic measure at mobility, which is kind of one of the things we saw was missing from the discussion.
Because zeroing in on the family structure aspect, other research in the past by Russ Chetty from Opportunity Insights at Harvard University has shown how family structure matters in the way that they analyze neighborhoods in which if you were born into even a single parent household, but the community itself had a prevalence of two-parent households, even then you were more upwardly mobile. You have more opportunity to be upwardly mobile in that neighborhood. But even if you're in a different context, if you're born to a two-parent household, but the community itself has more prevalence of single-parent households, you have less of a chance. So they analyzed that, they showed that correlation, but I don't think they dug deeper in terms of what are those mechanisms. And I think we're trying to show with the index that the role of family structure is key because, as Justin mentioned, parents are the ones that have more impact in the early childhood of their kids. That it's more about that. A lot of people like to focus on universal pre-K programs or other universal schooling programs from a younger age. But the research has shown by James Heckman, who's a Nobel laureate from the University of Chicago, has shown the importance of that, and not in the sense of having universal pre-K. It's more about if parents are engaging with their kids, if they're playing with them, if they're teaching them things because he shows the importance that inequalities you see later in life where kids are teenagers or later in life, you can already see them before age 3, those first 3 years. So it's an important literature that's out there that highlights that. But in conversations of social mobility, I think it's not highlighted enough, the role of family structure. So obviously we do like the work of Brad Wilcox a lot. And to complement that, I think these mechanisms in which families are key, just highlighting that message is important. But also, I think it's important to show that impact through parental engagement that is also key. And sometimes we just think, oh, we need to spend a lot of time with our kids, but sometimes it's just what we highlight in the index is just reading a book to your kids, helping them with homework, having dinners with your family. It doesn't have to be the amount of time, but just quality time as well. That impacts kids. And there is another recent research by Melissa Kearney, has a book out called The Two-Parent Privilege that came out at the end of last year that shows that importance and shows that digs deeper into those correlations. And in some ways, it's not only that two-parent households have two incomes; it's also the psychological resources that that two parents bring to a household. When I have kids. I don't know if Justin, I think you don't, but I don't know if Nick, you have kids. But sometimes when a parent is tired, it's even that psychological resource of having the other parent involved and sort of taking charge in that sense. It's having more quality time with them because one parent is either busy working or going to the store. It's just so many things that it's not just about the income that the two-parent household provides. Some of these other sort of intangibles, things that some of them we do measure in their index, some of them we can't, but it's just highlighting the importance of family structure, I think, is very key in this debate. And it has become, this conversation about mobility has become so politicized and so taboo sometimes that even highlighting the role of family structure is not encouraged. But we think it should be. And I think, as you mentioned, and Justin has mentioned, Utah is one of the best states that ranks for that. And I think your reports also highlight that. So I think that's an important asset that the state has.
We need to go to a quick break, but I want to sort of tie a ribbon on that the impact of family structure and also parental time with kids. And that's something that we've talked a lot about on this podcast. We've put out some writing on it from Sutherland Institute here. But I want to frame the question this way, and tell me if you guys think I'm off base. Looking at all the variables that impact upward mobility and long-term success for the next generation, if I had to pick one thing to make a difference on, if I could wave a magic wand once, it would be to have every child raised in a married two-parent household. Yes, of course, with as little childhood trauma as possible. So those things matter too. But in general, having as many of our kids raised in stable, healthy, two-parent married households would be the biggest impact, would provide the biggest impact for their upward mobility, especially by your holistic measure, later in life. Does this index back that up, or are there things that kind of statement misses?
Well, in terms of the index itself, we kind of equally weight all of the variables or into each pillar at least. So we didn't really get into what do we think is most important, because we want it to be as objective as possible and kind of just rely on what the data said based on things that we noticed was important for mobility. But I don't disagree with you that I think if you had to pick one as to, that would definitely be, I'd have to think more, but at least for me, it would be at least at the very top in terms of, the data just speaks for itself in terms of how much better children tend to be when they're in a stable household. It's just undeniable that all things equal, you would rather be in a stable household than not. And I think, again, as we get into that life cycle, well, if success as a child doesn't just matter for the child when they're children, it matters for them as adults. So that really, if you can sort of provide an environment in the beginning, you can get to a point where they're better off for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a top 5, top 3 element. As Justin said, we didn't really measure that causality. I think it's very, very important. As I said, it's underappreciated and under-discussed in this debate, or it's highly politicized. However, I would say, I'm originally from Latin America, and sometimes what we see in our countries, and I'm an American now as well, but what I've seen in Latin America as well is that we have sometimes good family structure, but also if there's no business environment creating more jobs, which is one of the main ways to climb the income ladder, to earn an income is through a job. So if there's no proper entrepreneurial dynamic environment, there's no rule of law with sound institutions backing that, you can have a great family structure, but we need those other elements as well. But I would think they're all work together. And that's what we're trying to show, that it is a sort of a holistic endeavor that we're trying to do. But I think it's one of the top 3 issues that needs to be discussed more, needs to be analyzed more. As you said, obviously, taking into account childhood trauma, all those things or staying married but having a bad sort of family environment also matter a lot. So it's not that it's not that it's without caveats.
Well, let's take a quick break, and then when we come back, I want to get into some of the things that maybe you didn't focus on as much in this social mobility index, one of which is race and ethnicity, because that's a big topic in the national dialogue right now about whether or not or how much it impacts opportunity, especially for the next generation. But I also want to talk about income inequality versus mobility, because you do make a distinction about that in your papers. So those are kind of two flashpoints in the public debate around opportunity that I want to get into and get your thoughts on. We're going to take a quick break and come right back with Defending Ideas. We've been talking with Gonzalo Schwarz and Justin Callais from the Archbridge Institute about their new social mobility index, ranking Utah as number 1 in the nation. This is Defending Ideas. We'll be right back.
Sutherland Institute is an independent, nonprofit public policy think tank based in Salt Lake City, Utah. Our mission is to defend the principles of the American founding and strengthen the institutions of civil society essential for those principles to endure. Sutherland provides research, events, and multimedia to policymakers and the public to promote the principles of faith, family, freedom, opportunity, and responsibility. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. I'm Nic Dunn, and our guests on this episode have been Gonzalo Schwarz and Justin Callais from the Archbridge Institute, talking about a new social mobility index that ranks Utah as the number 1 state in the nation for upward mobility. Before we continue with the conversation, I want to mention, if you like what you're hearing today, please visit defendingideas.org. You can find access to this show and previous episodes with things like short clips that you can share on social media in your conversations with friends and family about these issues. You can also subscribe to this podcast on any of the major platforms like Apple, Spotify, Google, wherever you like to get your podcasts. Just search for Defending Ideas and click that subscribe button. That's defendingideas.org. Gonzalo and Justin, I want to pick up where we left off and dive right into what I think are two of some of the most contentious and controversial topics related to social and upward mobility, and those are race and ethnicity and then income inequality. I want to start first with race and ethnicity. Anyone who's watched the public debate, especially on the national level, in recent years, it is clear that there are many, many voices that are arguing that someone's race or ethnicity is a very powerful determining factor that impacts their chances of upward mobility. That didn't seem to be something that you all focused on as much in your report and your mobility index. Why is that?
Well, I think Justin can talk about specific indicators and how they might affect one group or the other, but just in more broadly, the research on measured mobility, how much mobility there is in different areas. There was a big study by Ross Chetty, again, from Harvard University in around 2018, in which, first of all, there was a misleading, I think, claim by the New York Times talking about that research, that there was extensive racism that punishes a specific group. And the main point of that research was that after measuring mobility across different areas and through ethnicity, that Black boys are the ones that have less upper mobility than other groups. But the research didn't say that it was because of racism. So that's what I'm saying, the misleading New York Times headline or narrative. But the research itself showed that a lot of different ethnic minorities are doing well. Black women are doing as well as white women or other minorities or ethnicities. Asians are doing much better than even whites. So there is a more nuanced conversation there that didn't show that there was a specific issue there regarding race and ethnicity. So we didn't look into that, the national conversation, even if some media outlets will want to sort of steer the conversation one way or another. There wasn't anything that was out there in the data that showed that was the case. Now, I think Justin can talk about specific indicators or things that we measure that might affect some minorities more than others. But in the broad sense of that debate, there isn't, I think, clear evidence that is affecting it. And we're trying to just showcase how other indicators might affect all groups at the same time.
Yeah, I think on that point, what's missing in that conversation and why one of the things we wanted to focus on in the mobility index is barriers to mobility is that a lot of the things that are getting in the way of people of different races and ethnicities are often state actions. So if we think of in terms of like regulation, right? Well, if someone's already born poorer, when it comes down to doing something like getting an occupational license in order to do some sort of job, well, it's going to be really difficult for an already poor person to come in and, better afford to spend the time and pay the fees associated with getting that license. If we think of which groups are most impacted by corruption and poor legal systems, it is often minorities, right? There's typically that states with terrible legal systems like Louisiana, or states that are very corrupt like Louisiana or Illinois, are often ones who target different minority groups at their own expense. And finally, if we think of also school choice into some respect. So when we think about education, we think about school choice. And oftentimes the way many schools are funded, a lot of public schools are funded, is through property taxes. So of course the richer areas are gonna have houses that are worth more, which is going to make their schools better, well funded. Well, if you have school choice, that gives people options who are not happen to be born in a specific zip code or to a specific neighborhood. You're going to give those different people opportunities to get a high quality education somewhere else, and it's not as kind of stuck of, oh, you must go here, even though it's poorly funded and it doesn't have the resources that people argue that it should, or the resources at least aren't being used in the best ways, in the best interest of the actual children.
So to that point, do you think that when other folks who look at this, who do argue that there is a significant impact of race on outcomes, do you think the flaw is that just they're using it as a proxy variable without really realizing it? So basically, if there is some correlation with some of these different racial groups, as you're mentioning, Justin, that really there are other deeper variables at play, that those are the variables we should be going after. You mentioned some of the government actions, regulation, educational choice. Obviously, we talked about family structure in the previous segment, but is that a fair way to kind of categorize it, that there are other deeper things at play? That's what your data shows, and those are the things that are ultimately more impactful, and that's where the policy intervention should focus. Is that a fair summation?
I think absolutely, yeah. I think basically they're missing the forest for the trees, is that they're focused on just specific races and how do they differ in terms of mobility or incomes, which, to some extent matter and are interesting. But when it comes down to policy implications for that, they're missing what exactly are the things that are getting in the way of those people of different ethnicities and groups from being able to be mobile and from being able to achieve their own American dream, whatever that looks like for them.
Yeah, and that's, I think, what's behind what we mentioned before about the lack of consensus or the lack of nuanced conversation around some of these things, because there are disparities, but the idea is to go behind the disparities and see what are the root causes that are affecting it. In the case of family structure, for example, that's one of the, we were discussing before, one of the bigger issues, and that is affecting more minority families maybe, but it would affect the same groups that are not minorities as well. So the issue itself is more important than the ethnicity of the race.
Another thing I want to ask you about, as I mentioned before the break, is income inequality, because it's another one of these flashpoints in the debate over upward mobility. And I want to kind of throw out a statement and see what you guys think and sort of measure this sentiment against your social mobility index. And I'm going to channel some Arthur Brooks here as well, so credit to him for some of these ideas. I don't care as much about income inequality itself, because what I do care is the upward mobility potential of people trying to get out of poverty. And so if someone is able to improve their own life, gain an education, have access to work opportunities, be able to engage in family formation, kind of these three, principles as I took away, and some of these other pillars that you guys talk about in your index, if they're able to do those things and dramatically improve their own life throughout their lifetime and provide a better life for their kids, that to me is what we should be focused on. So rather than focusing on inequality, which again, in the words of Arthur Brooks, if all you care about is income inequality, then you would be just as happy pulling down the top as he would lifting up the bottom. So my pitch is, let's care less about income inequality and more about just what does it take to lift the bottom up. How does that sentiment weigh against what you found in the data, your social mobility index, kind of just the framework with which you approach this?
Yeah, in more broadly, I think that's definitely the sentiment we agree with and we're trying to capture. But just to step back, there are definitely two different issues, two different things, social mobility, income inequality, that have been intertwined, I think, too much, and they've been politicized too much in this debate. The thing is that the other research has shown that there is a correlation between both things. It's a natural correlation. If there's no mobility, if there's stagnation there, the gap will grow bigger. So it is sort of, it's already embedded in that. But what we're trying to say is that there might be barriers or issues that are affecting both things at the same time, generating more inequality and mobility. I think what's important there is that we're trying to say that if your way of caring about the poor is caring about inequality, that's okay, but it shouldn't be at the expense of reducing, of bringing other people down. And I think, and that's more about zero-sum narrative about flourishing and success. I think social mobility is more of a positive-sum narrative in which we can all climb at the same time. So what we're trying to, I think, show with this index and just our general work on mobility, that there might be some barriers sometimes that are affecting both things. And for example, if it's a bad school system, for example, that's one of the issues that other research has shown, our index is showing, is that if there's a bad school system, middle class or upper middle class people can either move neighborhoods to where there's a better school system, can do more homeschooling, can do more private, send their kids to private schools, but the poor can't, and they're stuck with where they are. But the issue there is not that one group can and the other can't, but it's more about that barrier of the bad school system. That's what we should be paying attention to. Or what Justin mentioned about occupational licensing, which is a barrier to entrepreneurship. Any barrier to entrepreneurship, sometimes upper middle class families or upper class families can have more resources to overcome that barrier, either by having more time to train for a degree, to get a license, or having more income or family income and friends to invest in a new venture. But it will take them more time, will be more complicated. It's just more barriers to entrepreneurship. Or if higher taxes then disincentivize that formation of new businesses, which still middle class upwards can have more resources to address that. But the poor can't. But the problem are, again, those barriers. And that's what I think what's missing in that inequality and mobility conversation, which to reduce inequality, you just, one of the main solutions is just to tax and redistribute more. And that sort of reduces that gap. But that doesn't speak about the broader, more holistic narrative about how we can all climb up the income ladder. Sorry, Justin, interrupted you at the beginning.
Oh, all good. No, I was just going to mention one small point, which is there's basically a good type of inequality and there's bad types of inequality. And it's hard to disentangle the two. We think of good types of inequality, right? Me and Patrick Mahomes had the same opportunities to go to the NFL. Unfortunately, my height, athletic ability, throwing ability, et cetera, prevented me from doing that. But my life isn't worse off because Patrick Mahomes is a better quarterback than I am. My life's better off in the sense that I get to watch him perform. So in fact, that sort of inequality isn't bad at all. The bad types of inequality, again, I think are people missing the forest for the trees. The bad types of inequality are those that from getting in the way of people, basically, or the barriers of getting in the way of people to achieve their own dreams and possibilities. So that is corruption. That's lack of economic freedom. That's lack of a solid family structure. That's just the lack of people having the choices to do what they want. And that's a type of bad inequality, but it's hard, when you just look at the number of, what percentage of wealth is owned by the top 5% or something, that doesn't really tell, that tells us something, but it doesn't really get the whole story on its own.
We're approaching the end of our time together, but I want to ask, but before we start to wrap up, that you both have used the phrase removing barriers multiple times, and that theme is there throughout the paper itself. What's refreshing to me about this approach that you guys are taking is that it is focused on this idea of let's remove barriers, let's clear the path so Americans are able to pursue their own happiness, their education, their work, their family life. And And that should be the focus of a really holistic anti-poverty agenda. Compare that to so much of the narrative we hear, which is, again, just pushing resources to folks. I think, Justin, you just mentioned that if all you're trying to do is narrow the income inequality gap, then pure redistribution of wealth would achieve that. Let's tax the folks at the top and let's give more to folks at the bottom. But if that's not actually removing the barriers for folks at the bottom to be able to earn their own success and climb the ladder with those institutional supports that you're talking about, we're not actually fixing the core issue. So I want to ask for your thoughts on that. That is, if we were to take away something, if our listeners walk away with one big thing, it's that, okay, the best anti-poverty approaches are not solely focused on just pushing resources to folks at the bottom, but rather the best anti-poverty approaches are focused on removing barriers and building up those institutional supports that help people climb up. Is that something that our listeners can take away? And if so, what would you add to that?
Yes, I think that's definitely something that they can take away. What we are also including in the social capital pillar is charity and community and how people help each other. So sometimes I think even if there is something that people need, they need sort of to re-engage with the labor market because they've been out of it for a long time, or they're having problems with, addiction or other more personal problems. Nonprofits and charity on the ground that build that social capital in every state are, I think, the best vehicle for sort of local philanthropy to help in those environments, and something that like welfare at the national level or a federal plan might help. We need a safety net, but it's not going to sustainably help people get out of some of these issues that are not going to be solved only by policy. So people need some support in some parts of their lives. One of the things that's interesting about youth is that you have the one-stop sort of shop for welfare in terms of everyone can go to just one place, so that makes it less cumbersome, less bureaucratic, and people can get the help they need even from the local government. But I think some of these variables that we're highlighting in the social capital and charity components are also that people on the ground helping others. That's part of the American dream. That's part of a strong a social fabric that is important to highlight. That's where people are going to get some of these are going to get the help that they need. But I think definitely the main way is just let's remove as many barriers as we can. And once that's done, we'll also need to consider that support system that local communities provide, that local philanthropy provides. And that's what we think is more impactful for communities, that sort of local support. And people, someone from Utah, for example, is going to be different. They're going to have a different approach. Or wouldn't know how to help maybe someone in Louisiana, which is the bottom state. There's different issues with local knowledge that play into the conversation, but that's something where local charities and philanthropy can have a big impact.
One of the things I love about this, and in my career previously, in some different roles in the past, I worked a lot on poverty issues at the county level as a policy advisor for county government, and we went through and did an assessment of. We talked with caseworkers at the state level, some of the social service providers at the county level, and individual folks who are experiencing deep chronic poverty in Salt Lake County, in this area around Salt Lake City, Utah, and without question, the overwhelming narrative was the vast majority of people who are in poverty and receiving safety net programs don't want to be there. They want to get out. They want to become self-sufficient. They want to work and provide a better life for themselves and their families. And it was just so inspiring because it totally refutes the narrative of vast swaths of Utahns or Americans in general just wanting to sort of live off of the government. They don't want to. The problem is there are barriers in their way that make it harder for them to earn their own success and get out of the cycle of poverty and move toward true self-sufficiency. So that framing of let's clear the path, I think, is incredibly inspiring, and also I think tracks with reality on the ground. As you said, Gonzalo, doesn't mean we shouldn't have a social safety net. There's a very important role for that. As we wrap up, I want to sort of take that concept of removing barriers and apply it to Utah. I'm a proud Utahn. I love the state. I love hearing about how great we are on different metrics, and it's great talking about that. But we're not perfect. There's still important areas where we can improve. So I want to ask you two questions to close off. Number one, what can Utah do differently to be better than we already are when it comes to social upward mobility? And number two, what should other states learn from either your index or what Utah has done well? And how could the national debate on these issues be improved because of the data you have and the successes in Utah? So let's start with, what should Utah do differently?
So on that point, I'm really glad you asked this question, because while, again, as we've discussed a lot already, Utah scores quite well, and again is number one in the country on this. But one thing we noticed that I found interesting is, since we're looking at a holistic approach, there's states that are at the bottom but still have areas in which they do really well in, and states at the top like Utah where they still could do a lot better. When we look at Utah, the things that strike out the most to me is its regulations. When it comes to occupational licensing and barriers, Utah has some of the more stringent occupational licenses in the country, which again I think is a way in which targets those who are already at the bottom, which can oftentimes be minorities. If we think about housing regulations scores, they also score pretty low. Basically, it's harder to build in Utah than it is in maybe other states. So I think this is something that Utah, at least recently, is trying to improve on. It seems to be things that the governor has talked about, but it's still something, nevertheless, that can be improved upon. And finally, I would say that on education is where Utah also seems to score pretty low. I think they scored maybe 30th in terms of education quality and freedom. Basically, their university mobility is pretty low in the sense of what percentage of people who go to college have a positive return on investment. I believe it's something like a third of Utah college students end up having a negative return on investment for their colleges, and which is kind of surprising in the sense that we know it's not the labor markets in Utah, because the labor markets in Utah are quite lax. So there's obviously something else going on. And then finally, school choice, I believe, is something that Utah can improve upon. Again, this is something that seems to have some traction in terms of improving, but I think that's one way in which families can best give their child the opportunity to learn in the way that the parents see best. At the end of the day, the parent is the child's guardian and the one at the end of the day responsible for them. If they're responsible for choosing almost everything else for the child, there's no reason they shouldn't be responsible in choosing what their education looks like.
Just on those two fronts, and you mentioned the two in particular, educational choice and occupational licensure. As you mentioned, Justin, occupational licensing reform has been a priority of our current governor. And then on the school choice front, just last session, Utah passed something called the Utah Fits All Scholarship. That's an educational savings account. So some of the things are identifying that you're right, that there is traction and momentum there in a positive way. So wrapping up, just your quick kind of soundbite takeaway of at the national level, either other states or when these debates happen federally, what's something important that folks should remember? What can we learn from Utah, or how can this data positively influence some of these other discussions?
I would say something that even goes beyond what we were able to study in the data, but something that seems to be important when just looking at sort of what's going on in Utah, is their no wrong door policy, which I believe is the name for basically in terms of welfare, right? So given the fact that we do have welfare and it's often provided at a national level, and there are some state welfare policies, of course, but a lot of it's done at the national level, Utah's done a really innovative thing in terms of basically no matter where you go to try to get welfare support, they can help you with every part of it. It's not that you have to fill out this form with housing and then go to this office and form to get food stamps or food availability. And then for school, you go here, and then, different vouchers, you have to go to, different offices, spend your whole day, which if you're spending your whole day doing something like that, what are you not doing? Having the ability to go find a job or something that can actually help you escape that. You're just going through bureaucratic red tape. I think that's definitely something that I believe the federal government has prevented other states from doing. And I think that would be a huge benefit, because it's obviously working in Utah. The welfare systems are close to one another. They have a policy where there's, you can go wherever to get whatever support you need. You don't have to go through all these hoops and such. So I think that would be something that, while we can't exactly capture in our measure, it's something that just seems obvious in terms of things that would help everyday people. That's something that Utah seems to be doing really, really well.
Yeah, and I would say that the dynamism of its economy is one of the key highlight that other states should try to emulate. In the sense, we think about, as I mentioned before, social mobility as the economics of human flourishing. And when you focus on job creation, entrepreneurship, what that opens up is just more paths to flourishing for different people, creating new industries, attracting investment. So obviously there is issues to work on in terms of occupational licenses, but just more broadly, the state is dynamic. The state has been able to attract a lot of investment from other companies, from other, even attract people from other states to come work there. So I think that's a huge issue that's not discussed as much. Still, the income from a job is the main way to climb the income ladder. It's not a welfare plan that's going to help obviously people, and that could help for not getting people stuck in dependency. So obviously, benefits cliffs and all those issues matter. That's maybe a topic for another conversation. But at the end of the day, it is a job. It is the private sector and job creation that allows for more paths to flourishing, more opportunities for people to find a job that they love, a job that they want to do, a job that pays well, for them to have more resources. So I think that aspect of Utah being welcoming to entrepreneurship and new businesses and having that strong business dynamism is very key that other states should emulate, besides, obviously, as we discussed, the strong family structure component that could come either from not having a lot of these welfare plans that generate dependency or not affecting the family. And it also could be a cultural thing that sometimes some of those things are not easily copied in terms of policy, but just the importance that the state gives or people in the state give to the family structure is very good. So that's something that if other states can emulate or try to think about more deeply about it, that I think that would be key.
Well, we want to thank you both so much for lending your time and expertise in talking about this issue and for the work you've done on the Social Mobility Index from Archbridge Institute. I think it'll be a source of information and data to inform these kinds of conversations, not just in Utah, but all around the nation. So thanks for your work on that. Once again, we've been talking with Gonzalo Schwarz and Justin Callais from the Archbridge Institute. Thank you both so much for being with us on Defending Ideas.
Thank you very much, Nick.
All right, thank you very much, Nick.
Well, we have one more quick break before we leave you with a final message. This is Defending Ideas. We'll be right back.
Sometimes it's hard to keep up with the latest policy debate that affects your life. The solution? Subscribe to Sutherland Institute's weekly newsletter, where you'll find in-depth insights from seasoned policy experts, compelling multimedia, and advance notice of special events. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. Before we go, there's really one key takeaway I want to emphasize from this discussion, and that's this. As you're evaluating elected officials and their ideas to address poverty, remember this key thing. Fighting poverty can't be just about pushing resources to people. It has to be about removing barriers so people have the freedom and opportunity to earn their own success and create a better life. There is a role for the social safety net, but hard work, innovation, and the freedom to actually pursue success need to be at the core of any efforts that hope to reduce poverty. We hope that you have enjoyed this episode, that you feel better equipped to defend some of the ideas we talked about today. Please visit us at defendingideas.org. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on Apple, Google, Spotify, wherever you like to get your shows. Just search for Defending Ideas and click that subscribe button. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel to get all of these episodes on video and the short clips we put out that you can use on social media and in your conversations with friends and family. Lastly, if you want to support the work of Sutherland Institute, please visit sutherlandinstitute.org/donate. That's it for this episode of Defending Ideas from the Sutherland Institute in Salt Lake City. I'm Nic Dunn. We'll see you next time.